Dr. Ciaran McMahon, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you.
Well, all the way from Dublin, Ireland, one of my favorite places.
Yeah, it's fantastic to be included. It's a completely different time zone here and a completely different temperature as well, I believe.
Right. We're having 100 degrees here in Northern California today, and it's evening for you, I guess, almost evening.
Yeah, it's what is it, 7 o'clock in the evening? It's balm evening here in Dublin. It's a lot less than 100 degrees, I can guarantee you. I don't Fahrenheit, but it's a lot less than 100 degrees.
Right. And I'm happy to have learned that you are a listener to Shrink Wrap Radio on occasion, and I'm glad to be able to have this opportunity to speak to you and about this great book that you've written, which is called The Psychology of Social Media, which strikes me as just a huge topic and a moving target, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, it's something, it's a topic I've been interested in for I'd say well over a decade now. And I guess the thing that really struck me was that I came up with this idea for the book, and I mean, every author will probably tell you this, but I didn't, I couldn't believe that nobody had written it before.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a fairly, it's a structured topic, like psychology of social media, but I didn't really find anything on the market that I could compare it to. So that's kind of the background of where I came at it. But then as I got into it, I started to understand why nobody hadn't done it before.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because it is a moving target. By the time you write whatever you're going to write, it's going to be somewhere else probably. Big changes, although not moving maybe as fast now. A lot of it is sort of settled and in place with some major players who are kind of dominating the space. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. You have an interesting career, and because you are a historian and philosopher of psychology. And so that made me wonder, well, how did that happen? And how come you didn't become, quotes, a real psychologist?
Yeah. Well, I guess it kind of happened a little bit by accident. So when I left high school and I was choosing my undergraduate, and at University College Dublin at the time, there were two options. So there was a BA, which was 3 years, and there was a BSc, which was 4 years. And a friend of mine just said, well, why don't you pick the BSc first, because you get 4 years in college. I thought, okay, I'll do that, because I liked science. And so I went in, and then you had your first year was basically pure science. So you had maths, biology, chemistry, that sort of thing. So I had the first year of hard science. And then we started into psychology, and then in the second year. And so by this stage, I'd already done the white coats, laboratories, chemicals. And then we started doing psychology practicals and psychology experiments. And it was sort of the experience of having gone from chemistry, where, in your lab practicals, you do the experiment until you get the right answer.
Yeah.
But psychology practicals, it was like, well, you're not going to get the right answer because you're not naive subjects, and we'll just tell you what you should have gotten. And that really got me thinking, because I was like, this isn't science. I don't know what this is, but it's not science. That kind of took me into, I had a great professor in history of psychology, Dr. Adrian Brock, who really scratched beneath the surface of these kind of things. And we had other professors like Professor Ciaran Benson, who was into cultural psychology. And that kind of gave me a different background, and I was leaning towards it naturally. And of course, you do your final year project, and it was all very empirical, and it just didn't sit right with me. So I went then to do a PhD in the history of psychology, and that's kind of how I got into it. And then I suppose my topic in my PhD then was like it was purely a literary theoretical kind of thing. I was looking at the language of psychology in terms of the concept of attention, and I dug into that. And I mean, the sort of the within the history of psychology at the time, that was sort of the vogue, was that you look at concepts and you find where they originate. Most of the work was kind of showing that an awful lot of psychology's concepts, its language, was originating in the 19th or the 18th century at best. You know, you trace them back, like things like personality and temperament, they're all originating that time. But what I found was that with attention, it went way back. I ended up reading the Stoics and Augustine and
oh my goodness
Aquinas.
You know, it's interesting that you settled on attention, because in my own doctoral study, I focused on attention as a key thing in altered states of consciousness, such as meditation and hypnosis. And it just seemed to me that attention was pivotal for a whole lot of phenomena. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because we've got a lot of other stuff to discuss here. But I think the kind of study that you do is so important for the field, because we do need people who step back and aren't necessarily as embroiled in it, and give us some historical perspective, so that we see so much of what we think and say is not as new as we think professor to be, and also to examine the philosophical assumptions and so on. So that's great. Well, I think this was a very challenging thing to take on, and you had to narrow it down somehow. And I guess we can say that you've got some chapters, and maybe that's the approach that you settled on to delimit it. You've got, I think, 2, 4, 6 main chapters called Profiles, Connections, Updates, Media, Messaging, and Values. So maybe you can, instead of us going deeply into each of those chapters, why don't you just give us the headline of what each of those chapters is about?
Thanks, Sid. So just for your viewers online, that's what it looks like. It's quite short. So if anybody, hopefully people will read this and have their appetite whetted for more. And if so, there's going to be a longer treatment of this subject coming next year. With profiles, what I'm really concerned about here is the idea that we have our own sort of little corner of the internet, and that's kind of I think it's the key attraction for an awful lot of people, that you can go online and this is a little place you can call your own. And it's the tension, I think, within this chapter is about finding somewhere that you can express yourself, but also that you're not too hemmed in. And so I think there's issues that I talk about in that chapter about how people want to express themselves, but not necessarily. It's very difficult to say I am this sort of person. So people don't really seem to typing it out, describing themselves. So they describe themselves implicitly, and that's difficult for the designers, because how do you structure a profile like that? And so sometimes then people like to use anonymous accounts, and what the reasoning behind that is, and temporary profiles as well. So there's a lot of complex psychology operating within the profiles. Then third chapter is about connections, which I think is probably what people do. It's the second thing they do after they go on social media, is they first set up their profile, and then they connect to people they know. And I also talk about what is the psychological value of connecting to people, what you get from connecting to strangers, what you get from what you need to be able to do on those things, how you connect meaningfully to people. The next chapter then is on, let me just check now, I should be able to remember this.
It's called Updates.
Updates.
Yeah.
So again, this is one of the tricky things with this book, was trying to condense the entire social media experience into a short book. Updates within this include blogs, any sort of text that you actually take the effort to type out. So it's tweets, it's Facebook updates, it's blog posts. I'm trying to think about like how people compose these things and what it is they're trying to achieve. Because at the same time you're writing something on social media, you're assuming that lots of people are going to see it, but actually you've no idea how many people read it. I also talk in there about how those updates are displayed in terms of news feeds and what happens to people who post something, an update there, that isn't actually seen by anybody. And that's part of how we start to get into the actual psychology of these systems, is that they reward you for posting something that is popular. And it seems like a truism, but they make popular things more popular. So when you go online and you go to Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, you will see something at the top of your feed that already has a lot of interaction. You know,
so in a way, it's an amplifier.
Precisely.
It can be an amplifier, and we'll be getting into that, I think. Your next chapter is called Media.
Yeah, and I could have probably just called it photographs and videos, but there's also live streaming in there. But it's what people are trying to do when they're putting a photograph of themselves up there. And I think there's photographs of themselves, and again, this could have overlapped with profiles, but it's like, what sort of things do people photograph and why do they photograph them? And it's a concept I'm getting at in there that I think when is the concept of presence, is that like when I'm talking to you now over, a Skype connection, we're trying to forget that it's actually mediated. So we're talking to each other as if we're actually in the same room. That's the idea.
Yeah.
What the designers of communications technology are trying to do, they're trying to engineer the effect of presence so that you forget about, how complicated this technology actually is, and you're completely immersed in it. And I think that's what people do when they're sharing photographs, is that they want other people to be there with them. So it's kind of the thing that you will often hear within sort of popular media when people would say, all these people are at a concert and they had their phones out, and could they not be in the moment? And it's like a big criticism of people, like, could they not be in the moment? And I take the opposite view, because I say, actually, I think the people who are there taking the photographs or live streaming or videoing a concert, it's not that they don't want to be there, it's that they want to bring other people to that place. So,
interesting. Yeah.
Weird.
Yeah.
I'm taking a little bit more of a benevolent approach to it.
Right.
I think that's the whole point, is that it's sharing the experience with other people who can't actually be there. And
let's
then
move on to the next chapter, which is called Messaging.
Messaging. And again, it goes back to what you're saying about how do you actually, define social media, because in this chapter, I sort of stray across into messaging, and I had to include this because even though social media is very much about being public, communicating public, every social media service will include a private messaging facility. And I talk about it's almost the semiotics of sending messages, because you're not just sending a message, you're also sending a timestamp. And what does it mean that if you send a message early in the morning or late at night, what other things can be read into the message? I also talk about when people say things, for example, in a status update, but that's actually meant to be a message. So it's sort of the psychology of subtweeting. And I also start talking about things like, because that was the other thing, was to try and include reference to not just your standard social media services. So I also talk in there about WeChat, which is very big in Asia, mostly in China. What people get from using a messaging service that they don't get from using a social media service. And I also talk as well about rumors and how they've been spread through WhatsApp, which is a really big problem in a lot of different parts of the world. So again, in these things, like, we're kind of like, a message is sort of something you think, well, I'm sending it from one person to another. But the fact that all of these sort of systems are so interconnected means that it's actually spreading outside of that as well. And that's something which I think kind of runs through the psychology of social media, is that we're building these services and we're building this technology, and our actual reflective understanding of it is so far behind. And it's a thing that I've noticed as well. It's another theme that I try and touch on, is that the scientific, theoretical, philosophical, critical literature on this has existed for some time. Like
I'm
presence, for
sorry,
example, is
you cut out just a little bit. You say the literature has existed
for quite some time.
for quite some time. Yeah.
So you can understand social media quite thoroughly, without with using literature that's maybe decades old. But the problem is that literature hasn't been popularized and hasn't been explained. And that's kind of what I'm trying to achieve with this book, is to sort of say to people, we need to reflect on this a little bit more, and we probably don't need new data to do that.
Uh-huh.
The literature that's already there.
I want to move you on to the next chapter, and then we'll have a more open kind of into discussion. The final chapter is called Values.
So in this, it's kind of what I'm getting at is the dual meaning of the term values, which I think is critical to understanding the psychology of social media. So we talk about values in the sense of morals or ethics, but we also talk values in terms of numbers and digits. And I think to understand what the ethics are of social media service, or what the underlying morality of them are, is actually to do with numbers and digits. And I talk through like a case study, a number of different things about how ultimately what we were worth to these services is the amount of traffic that we can generate. And in a sense, this is pretty obvious. Like, these are essentially advertising networks. And that's something as well that we have to bear in mind, is that social media as a technology in and of itself, it could be quite neutral, but it's the fact that every social media service is actually a private, profit-making corporation. Like, there's no state-owned social media, there's no non-profit social media. All of these are to generate revenue. So our value to each of these services is essentially what I say is a probability calculation. So how likely is this person to click on any given ad? And I think ultimately, and we're going to talk a little bit later about the dark side of social media, but to my mind, it's not really the dark side of social media. It's more kind of the hidden side, which is possibly the same meaning, but it's the side that we haven't thought about. And I think what actually happens is every time there is a controversy in social media, what's actually happening is we're remembering what we tried to forget is how these systems actually operate. And they haven't really hidden that from us, but it's something that I think people like to forget, is that ultimately this is an advertising network and it's supposed to generate money. And that means that we're a product to an extent.
Yeah, and that does begin to get into the dark side. I'm actually planning to name this episode something about the dark side of social media, but I do want us to acknowledge the light side as well. In other words, that there are benefits, and we wouldn't be involved. None of us would probably be involved with this if we didn't have a vision of possible benefits for ourselves and for our communities and so on. So let's start off in a kind of general way. What do you see as, what's the gift of social media in terms of the positive light side gift?
That's a really good question. I think in terms of for the individual, there is the genius of these services is that they allow an individual to present themselves in a way that they would like to be seen. And without these technologies, that's actually quite tricky, because without the internet, how do you actually change your self-image? You can say, I'm a different person now, but it's hard to believe that. But if you change your profile, if you update the way you're looking online, if you change how you're being, you will appear differently to different people. And that's a great way of changing of managing your self-impressions. And that's sort of...
I'm going to want to come back to that when we get into the dark side, because there's this really big story about that we gave you a heads up about that earlier. But go ahead. Yeah. So in a way, this is we were talking about it working as an amplifier. It can be an amplifier of our persona, which I think is kind of what you're talking about, the way we present ourselves to the world.
Yeah, I think that's like that is even like critical scholars. It's kind of that's where I got that theme from. Is that it's that difference between how you see yourself and how you would like to be seen. That little gap is what these guys have managed to monetize. And when you think about that, that's an incredible thing to actually have done. They've monetized a reasonably basic human desire by creating these services where, and as well, it's something that I mentioned then in chapter 2 when we talk about, and I think this the very concept of social capital. I don't really get into in much detail, but I think the very concept of social capital, going back to, as you probably remember, Putnam and Bowling Alone, that sort of conversation in the mid-90s about how communities were falling apart and how did people engage with each other. And that whole development of the concept of social capital, I think, was really crucial to the development of social media, because it kind of created the space where people thought our communities are falling apart, but maybe we can use the internet to reconnect with each other. And I think that's what has happened in a big way, is that people are using, like, people don't really see like the advertising network and so on. People might necessarily be interested in reinventing themselves, but they may well be interested in connecting with their family and their friends and adding people. And from that, like on Facebook, as I talk about, there's a good bit of research that shows that you will be able to create and maintain bridging social capital, which is, the sort of benefits that you get from strangers and acquaintances. But also the other thing that the research shows is that using something like Snapchat, you will possibly be able to create and maintain bonding social capital, which is much more to do with close family and friends. So these are very real things that empirical social science shows us that people are actually getting these benefits from. I think that you kind of have to acknowledge that in any sort of critical discussion of these services, is that people will kind of say to me, Facebook's bad, Facebook's terrible, Twitter's bad, and all of this. I say, well, literally billions of people are using these things every day. They wouldn't be doing that if the services were so horribly evil as, we kind of sort of assume that they are. People are getting a decent amount of benefit from them. And if they were so terrible, they would leave them.
Right. Well, for example, and I don't know if this counts as social media, what we're doing now, I think maybe it does, talking on like this. It's enabled communication between people at a vast difference, distance, that is, geographical distance as well as social distance, and and all sorts of other variables, racial distance, cultural distances, and so on. So potentially, there's a lot of value in that. And when we're in an optimistic and hopeful place, we can see nothing but that sounds like wonderful. That could solve all of humanity's problems. If we could just all communicate with each other, then we would all understand one another and all problems would go away. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Not exactly the whole story.
It's interesting because that was kind of it's in chapter. It's the start of chapter 3 when I talk about the Icebreaker Challenge, and it was that came at, what was it? It was 2014, and with people sharing these videos of themselves drinking water and then nominating each other. The whole thing spiraled out of control in a really positive way, and I think that was probably, you could say, the end of the golden era of social media, because the previous few years in that you had like this sort of Arab uprising and Twitter being used in these things, and there was all this sort of move that social media was going to democratize previously authoritarian countries and so on, and the mood was incredibly positive. It turns out that that's can open up connections between all people, it's not a given that positivity is going to spread. And I think that that certainly governments and regulators and indeed users of social media bought up into the hype probably between about 2008 and 2012. I think the scales have fallen from our eyes around now, but an awful lot of the problems were apparent before then, certainly.
Yeah, definitely. So it's hard to talk about the positive, about the light side, without drifting into things. Whereas, and all other considerations begin to come in, and one area of one phrase that occurred to me was that, in a way, the story of social media and of technology generally is in part a story of unintended consequences. So you can get, I'm kind of a reflexive technophile. As a kid, I was interested in science and experiments and amateur radio and so on. So I've always had that side, but as time has gone on, I can see that there's always that possibility that some form of human mischief will distort things. And so unintended consequences, and I think there are a lot of unintended consequences here. And one that I would like us to explore is the negative impacts on youth, on young people.
Yeah, I think this is an area where I think most of the media attention has been focused on, and it's not without reason, because I think fundamentally that there's a lot of your listeners will be familiar with the concept coming from Jungian psychology of the identity crisis and identity formation within the adolescence and young adulthood years. I think ultimately this is like really where social media has actually been targeted and who it's been focused for. And I think the problem has been, in a lot of ways, that it's been assumed that everybody who uses social media is in that kind of frame where they want to change their identity, explore their identity, reinvent themselves, and so on. And it's certainly one of the things that many years ago that struck me, that where there was going to be a problem with Facebook was when Facebook moved into the news feed. So in about up until about, I think it was 2007, I discussed this in the chapter on updates. To see, if you were on Facebook, to see the last thing that your friends posted as an update, you had to go to their profile, and you didn't automatically see everything on your page. And then one day Facebook decided to combine everything together, and so that basically then from that on, they started as well to make as default setting that when you posted an update that everybody would see it. And it struck me at the time, and I blogged about this, that Facebook was essentially still being run by college students for college students. And if you think about it, when you're at university or when you're at college, I think gossip is an awful lot more of a way of how news travels. So everybody's interested in everybody else's romantic liaisons and who's getting on with who and what's going on with who. When you become an adult and you have a job, you have family, you still have your college friends, you're not necessarily concerned about that. And you also want to keep those groups separate. But Facebook sort of, and it's kind of to do with privacy, but it's more to do with what I talk about in the book, the context of context collapse. And it's something that I think older adults will want to keep your spheres separate. But sometimes, you could be out to dinner with your boss and then you bump into your cousin. And now you have to introduce these people to each other and you didn't want to. Social media makes that even harder than it already is. And I think that is a problem, because ultimately social media makes it an awful lot easier to combine all these things and to make you popular with everybody so that you can see everybody's updates. And that creates a certain focus on popularity, which isn't always very helpful. And I think that this is something which, certainly for some young people, they can use social media to leverage their careers in certain ways. And sometimes, like when you start talking now about, say, influencers and different ways that social media is used, some people, it's often written about in the popular media, papers and so on, that this is some kind of an outrage. People are using Instagram to sell, makeup or whatever, and they're selling themselves and portraying themselves in certain ways to create their own little businesses and careers. I always say, well, actually, that's basically what social media was designed for from the beginning. It was designed by people who were trying to push their own careers, and that's how they made it the way that they did. It's sort of their own particular social and professional needs of promoting themselves is what they built into these systems, such as LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter and so on. And so I think that's kind of, in a way, it's not separate to social media. In a way, it's actually inimical to our Western neoliberal capitalistic kind of cultures where entrepreneurialism and push yourself ahead and network and do it yourself sort of thing is actually core to how Western countries operate. But that's actually being sort of amplified in the microcosm of the individual. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of these issues. And I think
let me cut in just a moment here, because I'm aware that your voice is cutting, the sound quality isn't as solid as it should be. I'm running a fan on this side, and I was hoping that it wouldn't interfere, but I have to see if possibly the fan is creating that problem. So I'm going to turn off my fan, bake in the heat a little bit. I had raised the, do you hear a difference on your end, by the way, now that I turned the fan off?
No, actually, no. I can't hear the fan.
Okay. So I'll be monitoring to see if your voice still seems to be cutting in and out or not. With the, I was actually, when I raised the idea of youth, and you seem to be talking a lot about adults at this point, I'm thinking of kids, little kids. I have kids, and my kids have kids. So, and I don't have control over my kids anymore, my adult children. So if they're doing things with their kids that I don't approve of, tough. I can try to have a little influence, but it's not going to be major. So I'm a little shocked that we've got some very young children in our family now who are growing up with this media, who take it for granted and who want to get on camera and want to perform on camera and do perform on camera, and who are just terribly cute and all of that. But you have to wonder. And then when they get into the early teens, and sometimes sooner, their identity has not really formed. It hasn't fully coalesced. Their brain is still developing. And they may have a very fragile self-image. And so, of course, we've all heard these stories of young kids who've committed suicide because they're being bullied. They're being bullied by other little immature brains, insecure little brains that are out there trying to promote themselves at the expense of other people. So that, to me, that's a huge one. Another, something that you address in your book, I hadn't seen this acronym before. FOMO, is that what you say? FOMO, fear of missing out. It's certainly huge among kids, but maybe we don't ever fully get out over that, because as we look at the vacation photos or the party photos of whatever age we're at, it can give rise to feelings of inadequacy. Wow, these people are having all this fun, all this closeness in a wonderful environment. I'm just at home.
Yeah, it's these sort of issues are the ones which trouble me uh, in a number of regards because being a father myself, my wife and I have 16-month-old twins, two boys. So what a lot of my days revolves around now is trying to convince one son that he shouldn't take the toy off the other son.
Yeah, right.
Probably every parent goes through, but it seems to be mostly one-way traffic at the moment. And when you see things like that happening, it brings me to French philosopher. I couldn't mention this in the book, but it does sort of come through it a little bit. Rene Girard and his mimetic theory of desire. And this, I think, is really important for understanding interpersonal processes on Facebook or on social media generally, but also for understanding a lot of these cases of bullying and conflict. So Girard's theory is, he essentially says that, people don't know what they want. But when you see somebody else with something, you desire it because they have it. So people want what you want. You don't want what you want what somebody else wants. And what our society kind of evolves because we agree to put those desires to one side and we cooperate, because if we continue to compete over resources, we'll wipe each other out. And so you basically put those things to one side and you collaborate. And he has a lot of other ideas about how basically if, so you combine your resources, but if, like say there's a drought or something, he said that like in prehistoric times, what would happen is somebody would be scapegoated. And you can still see that this happens within our societies. Like if there's a president of a country and the economy collapses, he's booted out. And that's kind of like the system of how we do that. And actually, if the next time you're in Dublin, you can go down the road into the National Museum, and it's almost the first exhibition there are what we call bog bodies. And they're these bodies that they've found. They're about 2,000 years old. And it was really like the archaeologists couldn't understand them for a while because they seemed to be quite wealthy individuals with, good health, well-dressed 2,000 years ago, but they had been strangled. And what the theory is now is that these were kings who were sacrificed in a time of drought or a time of a crop failure. These are just...
Yeah.
Now, how this applies to social media is really rather bizarre because one of Rene Girard's students is a guy by the name of Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is founded, I believe it was PayPal, and he was co-founder of PayPal, and he was an early investor in Facebook. And he came up with the idea, I think when they were early in their designs, or he heavily supported the idea of the like button. And I don't know if he's on the record of saying this, but basically he said, the like button will show people what they like. So it'll show, I'll like something and then you'll see it, but then you'll also want it. So it then fuels that desire between people. And Facebook then becomes this like machine. Well, it's the same on all social media, really, rather than to single out Facebook, is that it allows people to see what other people are interested in. And then ideally it should, improve the desire for that, and then you can advertise and you can make money. But it actually makes people seeing what other people like also has the reverse effect of seeing what other people don't like, and it generates. And this is the thing, like Facebook will say that they actually only reflect what people are already competing over. But I think there is a significant possibility that it actually increases that and makes it worse. And I think this is the case in what happens in issues around cyberbullying and how that's related to suicides and all of those sort of things. It makes it easier to scapegoat people. it makes it easier to see the person who is different, and it makes it easier to push them out. And I think there's a great paper on this by a researcher here in Dublin, by a man by the name of Professor James O'Higgins Norman, and he shows how there was a case of a number of years back, a girl called Phoebe Prince, who was Irish but emigrated to America. And he shows how basically what happens in these situations, and it's often what happens in bullying, is that it's not that the person does anything particularly wrong. It's just that they're slightly different. And, there's a lot of research on how LGBT youth are the ones, or children of different races or of, disabilities and so on, are the targets of bullying. But sometimes it can be just as simple a difference as the kid who moves into the class in the middle of the school year, and they're just slightly different, and that disrupts the social order within the classroom, and it makes them a target. And so one of my main fears around social media is that it's kind of breaking the sort of the social contract that we already had, whereby we all like the same thing and we're competing over it, but we've left our sort of antagonism to one side for the sake of social cohesion. Social media is actually bringing all that to light, and it's making conflict a little bit more open and normal and acceptable. And I think that's quite dangerous. I'm not entirely sure how we get away from that.
Yeah, in fact, I was listening to something today. I guess it was on a podcast, actually, reviewing some TED Talks, and it was getting into an African American fellow who, having been beaten up by the police in the past, became intellectually curious about how all of this hate and vile stuff was being directed at him and other African Americans just because of the fact that they're African Americans. And so he decided to do some underground study by going on the internet and passing himself off as a white racist, superiority kind of guy. And it's interesting. He talks about how that impacted him. And this may take me too far off of where I wanted to go. I can't even remember now. I'm starting to tell this story. Well, the shocking thing about it initially was the things that people will say, just hateful, awful, ugly things. And as he began to look into, well, who are these people? He found that they were, in many cases, ordinary people holding down regular jobs, and people that you would, if you interacted with them at work or some other place, you'd say, hey, this is a nice person. This is a nice guy. So then he is struggling to understand, well, how do you get from there to this other place? And that's a whole nother discussion.
Mm-hmm.
But it liberates and magnifies kind of the worst possibilities, I think, in our characters. And because it's anonymous, that's why. Because we don't have a real sense that anybody who counts is going to see what we're saying. They're not going to know who I am.
Yeah, and that's the kind of it's one of the things I touch on in the chapter on updates, is that how the newsfeed algorithm works. And it essentially, unless you post something which is popular and gets a lot of interaction, you're punished with invisibility. So to actually be seen on there, because everybody's posting so much stuff, they can't present it all on the one page, which is fair enough. So they only show you up the algorithm the stuff that is new and the stuff that a lot of people close to you have interacted with. So that kind of gives you an implicit lesson that to be seen on social media, on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, you have to say something that gets that sort of attention. And that kind of, it's like the whole, I guess, myth of social media that we were all sold at the start, say 15 years ago, was that this would be a level playing field for everybody. But actually, the algorithm doesn't make it a level playing field for everybody. It makes it a place where the popular get more popular. And it means the rest of us have to compete with that if we want.
It brings to mind the word acting out, which we apply to children. And acting out has two sides. For some kids who kind of act out, it may make them popular. It may make they may be the class clown. And who knows, as they grow up later, they become a late night TV comedian. The best of all possible worlds. But the others who are simply annoying and they engage in negative attention getting, and that doesn't carry them forward in life, and it shoves people around, and it can cascade into a variety of problems. I want to, I alluded to this earlier, there was an incredible podcast out there that people may be aware of called Invisibilia, where they look at psychological topics and kind of go into them in depth. Even I don't think either of the hosts are psychologists. And so they did a story on Black youth gangs in Wilmington, Delaware. And when we went to two white guys, here we are talking about social media. And we have our views of what social media is about that probably, I know for me, is very much rooted in my life experience, my middle class, suburban life experience. And I kind of tend to generalize from that and assume that it's mostly about people like me that we're talking about. And so it never occurred to me before I had heard this particular podcast to think about, well, what's the impact of these tools and phenomena in what we would call ghetto neighborhoods, gang-ridden neighborhoods. And so they go into a gang-ridden, mostly African-American neighborhood in Wilmington, Delaware. And what they find is that there's heavy use of social media, like Facebook and the other ones like that. And what's happening there, it all begins with a killing of a young man who was popular, well-liked, did pretty well in school. But on social media there, some kids around 13, 14, 15, 16, they're trying to let the world know that they're cool, that they're tough, that they're with it. And so sometimes somebody in the family may have a gun because they belong in a gang or something, and a kid will pick up their brother's gun or something, or they've got some money maybe from a robbery or something. So this particular incident, there's this kid who's posturing like in the rap videos, being all gangster, throwing money up in the air, like maybe they've only got $100 that they've got here, but throw that money up in the air, so it looks like a ton of money, and flashing a gun. So now this guy has the people in his neighborhood, in other gangs, see this, and they say, oh, this guy's all tough, and he's in a different gang than we are, and we're gonna fry his goose, basically. And he ends up getting killed as a result of acting out a kind of teenage fantasy, which he's seen modeled a lot on social media. That's one of the worst and most powerful examples that I've come across.
It's shocking because, in a way, not really that unusual. There are phenomena like this. I haven't seen it quite like that, but I've certainly seen here in Ireland there's a lot of bare knuckle fighting, which gets called out through YouTube. So it happens in particular ethnic communities more than others, but it's certainly in deprived areas that guys will challenge each other to a fight. Yes, mostly guys, and they call them out, and it's all recorded. It goes on YouTube, and they call them out and say, "I'm going to fight you in this place at this time." and it can come down to, and it's not, you know, that they're organized, they're filmed, and it's all to do with image within a particular community. It's to do with standing, and it's to do with being disrespected and so on. And the thing is, YouTube don't mind these videos being up there because they attract a lot of viewers. And it's the sort of thing that, I mean, it's something that I mention in the chapter on updates about how when we post this stuff online, anything, whether it's a video or any kind of text or status update, we are still, even though now, like, kids like this will have grown up with social media, they've been used to it all their lives, we're still at the state where we're posting things online and we still don't believe that it's real. We still believe that the online space is, even though we're very well aware of the consequences, we still act as though it's fantasy. And so the kid posts this thing online and they still think there's not going to be any consequences to this because you can't actually see who's reading what you're posting. And we also sort of like, there's another, it's a great theorist of cyber psychology, Professor John Suler at Rider University, had this paper from like 15 years ago, and it's still relevant. But the concept that really sticks with me is he talks about solipsistic introjection, which is a little bit of a mouthful. But
yeah, really?
Yeah, he says that like when you're reading a novel, you imagine what people look like. And you imagine what they look like and you get a sort of picture of what the place looks like, and it develops as you go through the novel. And of course that's fine because the person in the novel isn't real, so it doesn't really make any difference. But and I think this is really key to how online dating actually took off, is that you would read, and this, if you imagine like online dating when there was no photographs exchanged or pen friends and things like that, you'd read the letters and the text from a person and you would imagine what they looked like. And then that became your image of them. And then when you met them, those two things mightn't be the same. Yeah. So always that kind of contrast. And I think even today, even in like when you're communicating with somebody on social media, you have the profile photograph, you possibly have videos of them and all of those sort of things. It's still not quite the same thing as meeting the person themselves. And I think that's where actually, and we can talk about, presence and so on. It's still not quite the same thing. And so I think when people are posting these things online, whether it's an image of yourself with the gun and the money and so on, you still haven't fully comprehended what, like, even though you might think about who your audience for this is, it's still not going to be the actual audience. It's like if he had actually thought for a second, oh my God, that gang down the street whose territory I live in, if they see this, it's still like the penny didn't drop. And that's, I think, fundamentally because we're using technology.
Yeah, and that's one thing that educators are hitting now with kids, with young people who are hopefully college bound, and they're warning them. They're saying anything that you post online that can really hurt your future career. I'm sure it's hard for kids to fully believe that and take it in, but we know now that that for important hires, scraping the internet is routine. To go and see, let's look into everything we can find by this person or about this person that's online.
And like at the same time, we have to be able to say, look, what happens on the internet is real and has consequences. But at the same time, there is this sort of undercurrent that I don't think we should forget about, is that the guiding philosophy of Silicon Valley is that cyberspace is a new frontier and it has different rules. And we should be allowed to do things differently there. So this means you are allowed to reinvent yourself. So there is a kind of a culture clash here, I think, between how, and maybe not now, but certainly in the early days of where this philosophy came from and how our society actually works in real life. how our, our institutions work and so on. There's a little bit of a clash there. And that is, I mean, I don't know how this is going to be resolved, because at this stage, the major technology companies are almost beyond regulation, and they are almost deciding that this is these things should be regulated. That's really difficult.
As a philosopher of psychology and a historian of psychology, what do you think of the fact that these large companies are hiring psychologists to help make these social spaces as addictive as they can, to make their involvement in games and virtual reality, other kinds of tools, to use their psychological nature, their psychological knowledge against us, in a way, against what you might think of as a reasonable social contract.
Yes, it's a very interesting point. I mean, in one sense, I can't really blame the social media companies for hiring people with this expertise, because, to make your product interesting and engaging, companies have, done this sort of behavioral insight research for a long time. So I don't blame them for doing that. In the other sense, there would not necessarily be a market for this sort of stuff if governments had, not just the American government, but Irish government, UK government, European countries, advanced developed nations. How I diagnose this problem is that after the financial crash in 2008, the funding of research in the social sciences by institutes of higher education collapsed. And now I think maybe 10, 11 years later, I think politicians are starting to realize that to form policy in this area, it would be useful if they had a solid body of social science research in this. And they're finding that they can't really reach that because, largely speaking, I think an awful lot of the social media corporations, a lot of the tech corporations have hired probably the smartest people in this field. And you can see, and to be honest, if you were coming out as a PhD student now, and you were like, if you had this knowledge in machine learning and analysis of social media data, and you can go, well, I can do a postdoc and that will probably get me maybe, I don't know, $30,000-$40,000 a year, or I can work for Facebook and I'll get $120,000. It's a no-brainer. However, it does sort of point to another thing, which is a deeper malaise in the last decade, which is, it was pointed out by a great philosopher of sociology, professor by the name of, what's his name now? Nicholas Rose at the London School of Economics. And he's written a number of books, like maybe a decade or more ago, but he characterizes psychology as the generous discipline. So all of psychology's methodologies, like in surveys and experiments and focus groups and so on, psychology kind of lets other areas of other disciplines use these. And to my mind, there's a whole branch of academic research, like communication studies, media studies, that field. I kind of think, to my mind, that's psychology should be doing that work. I don't think this should be a separate discipline. I think this is the communication studies should be part of psychology. But psychology has allowed other disciplines to do this, and simply by reason that psychology has to be, by its very definition, because it's by people, about people, psychology has to be understandable to other disciplines. It has to work like this. So that makes it quite tricky. Because psychology can't really, you can't talk about people in a language that is not understandable in some way by other people. You can't keep it secret. That would make it some kind of sort of Gnostic science, which wouldn't really work in practice. So that's a kind of an issue where I think in a lot of respects, psychology has allowed communication studies and media studies to take over the analysis of things like Facebook and social media. And I think that's fundamentally a problem. And I believe that other psychologists are starting to see this now, which is where kind of the idea of cyber psychology is starting to take hold. And fundamentally, the issue here for me here is if we study, and I talk about this in the very first chapter, is if I think we have to talk about social media as not as a media, but more as a self-technology, as something that a person, it's sort of psychological work that a person is doing on themselves. It's sort of self-technology, rather than treating it as a communications medium like television or radio, because I think that's a category error to talk about social media in that way. I think
so that raises an interesting point. I think that, you know, that the tools that we use, the so-called tools, they also shape us. We tend to think that it's a one-way thing, you know, that if I use a shovel, it's just a tool and it's for digging holes. But um, some past research has shown that social things are influenced by the kinds of tools that people are given to use. So that if you're a slave and you've been given a short hoe, or maybe not even a slave, but you're a migrant worker and you've got this short hoe that keeps you bent over all the time, it makes it easier for the boss man to see who's working and who's not. So it's not just a tool, there's built-in social implications. And so in the same way, there are built-in social implications in this technology that are not obvious to us. Again, it's the unexpected byproducts. So I'll ask you a very personal question. Do you think, and in what ways, has this technology affected your personality, how you see yourself, etc.? Can you talk about that, or have you reflected on that?
yes, I would say I have, because it's that kind of philosophy is something that has it's been with me from my doctoral studies, because it's something that I could see throughout the course of history, is the different technologies that how we understand ourselves is often a reflection of the technology that we're using. And I talk about technology in the broader strokes of literary practices. So it's the things that you read, it's how you write. And I looked at this I looked at this in Imperial Rome when, and we could do a whole other hour on this, on the origins of the development of silent reading and how that co-occurred around the same time in history as the idea of an inner voice or an inner space. And these two things happened around the same time.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the kind of the current discourse around social media is very difficult, because not only does it swing between is it good or bad, it also swings between is it having an effect or is it not having an effect. And there's an awful lot of hyperbole that goes, oh my God, it's destroying teenagers' brains. And then the serious research comes out and goes, okay, well, where's the evidence for this? And that kind of dynamic is there. And now I'm generally on the side of people that go, okay, let's see the evidence for these sort of things. However, my basic assumption is that if our society has gone from, say, 15 years ago, from never having used these things to 15 years later, we're all spending, hours per day. Billions of people are spending hours per day on these things. I think it's impossible that this is not changing us in some way. To your point, though, is that how exactly do we boil down how that has changed? Like, are we going to find neurological changes? I'm not entirely sure that that's the route to go down. I think we will find philosophical and social changes in how we write about ourselves and how we understand ourselves. And I think we're probably going to see, like you can see it as well in popular literature now, there's an awful lot of talk about self-care. And I think that self-care is very much bound up in the idea of social media. However, so I think that there is a huge amount of philosophical, psychological inquiry yet to be done that needs to be done. And that's where I see this book as sort of starting that conversation, is how do we actually boil down how this is how this possibly be changing how we see ourselves. But to actually answer your point about how I see it having changed me,
Uh-huh.
well, I did meet my wife on Tinder, and that's a very important connection.
Uh-huh.
And I actually had to use a fake account to do that. Because if you know, Tinder is it's integrated with Facebook, so you have to have a Facebook account to use Tinder. But what I found was when I was using my own account was that as we started off here, when pronouncing my name with the accent on the second A in Ciaran, when Tinder was integrating with Facebook, it wasn't rendering my name correctly. And I didn't like that. I didn't want my first impression to be of a, mashed up, messed name. So I created a fake account. So my wife first knew me as David, which I think is...
Wow. Now we're getting down to the good stuff here.
So I think it's also something that I sort of think sometimes that when I'm reflecting on different things and thinking about things that I'm researching, things that I'm analyzing, I'm trying to see if I can fit my thoughts into a tweet. And
wow.
It goes to a theory that I'm developing in my next book, which I hope your readers will also enjoy, is about the digitalization of psychology. I think that social media has encouraged us to break down every possible aspect of our being into bytes or chunks that can be given a numerical value. Like a tweet does have a numerical value. It's going to be less than 280 characters. It's going to be all in a particular script. So I think that's the assumption is of this sort of movement, is that everything that is valuable, and including every aspect of our psychology, can be digitized. Now, I think it is an assumption, and I think it's an incorrect one, but I think that's basically the assumption on which our society is going to be built, for better or worse, for probably the next 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, there's a concern about we think that we shape the machines, that we build the machines, but there's a concern that we find that we have to adapt to the machines.
Mm-hmm.
That, when you start interacting with a computer, oh, well, you can't do it that way. The computer requires you to do it this other way. And you have to learn how to do that. And you work very hard. Now, of course, they're trying to make computers that can deal with natural language, and they're making great progress, and so on. But still, there is that whole dimension. Well, we're going to run out of time and not talk about a whole bunch of the dark things that I considered on the dark side, and that there are national and international consequences to all of this. There's fake news, there's the undermining of trust, there's the sowing of confusion in populations, there's government censorship, government spying, the attack on privacy, and then you made allusions to the commercial drive or motivation that's really behind the development of all of this. And so under that broad rubric of commercialism, there's the selling of our personal information, black markets. You talked about something called upvoting, and I hadn't heard that. But does that refer? I know at one point I wanted to raise my profile on something or other, and I just found that, you can buy likes. So,
yeah.
Blush to admit, I bought a bunch of likes. I don't know that they did anything. Is that what upvoting is?
Yeah.
You can hire people to sit at a computer off in some distant part of the world and keep clicking a button for you if it requires that.
And I think that's I actually corresponded with Mihaly Hader, the author. He's Hungarian. I'm not sure if I pronounced his name right, about that. And he said that the scary thing was that I think he'd gotten the idea for the inspiration for that paper from somebody else. And they said that they believed that newspaper or media organizations were having their editorial direction was being shaped Like if you like say, for example, if you ask journalists what's the benefit of social media to you, they'll say, well, if I write something, I immediately see whether it's popular or not. And like in bygone days, they'd have to, wait for letters to come into the editor of the newspaper to see if the piece was correct. They say now it's instant, so they can see this was shared 100 times, this was shared 200 times. Okay, so people like that. But the thing is that now somebody with a reasonably small budget and without actually writing any fake news, they can just simply shape the direction of a newspaper by upvoting one particular type of story. And you can see how that would be very powerful now when we're talking about immigration, we're talking about racial issues, we're talking about the alt-right and so on. It's a very simple way of changing the direction of media output.
Yeah.
But also says as well that fundamentally, if social media is based on these values, these numbers of our popularity, if so much of those numbers are actually fake and are bought, then how accurate is this stuff really? How much of an actual reflection is it of sociality?
Yeah, one of the things that unfortunately I've kind of become somewhat addicted to is following what's called Apple News on my iPhone, where they've got summaries of the interesting and important news of the day. And what I'm realizing is it's so manipulative because the headlines are designed to get you to click on that story. And so the headlines will be the most extreme, maybe the most absurd, the most maddening, whatever, to get those eyeballs to click on that story. And I have this, I'm going to have to break myself of that habit. It's a thing that's easy to do when I've got a few extra moments, pull out my iPhone, look at the Apple News, scroll through and, see what's going on. But I feel a kind of a distaste, a sickness coming on of, I'm just getting tired of those kinds of headlines. It's like, too much.
Yeah. And
too much sensationalism. I don't want any more.
It's the thing is that I find personally quite difficult about this is that, we can say, okay, this is, I don't feel good about using this particular app, this particular service. But when you actually come to say, as people could ask me, so do I delete my account? And I say, well, I can't in good faith tell you to delete this service or that service if I haven't done so myself. Because I still use Facebook, I still use Twitter, I still use Instagram. And I think as well, it's very difficult to say to a person, and a lot of your listeners will know this as well, people who work in private practices, that if you're telling somebody to quit something cold turkey, even though I always refrain from using the term addiction around these services, because I think addiction should be reserved for, heroin and serious issues. I think with these services, it's a dependency, but I think using addiction is too strong. Even if you say to somebody, okay, you don't feel good about being part of this service for whatever reason, what do you replace it with? That's the critical thing, is that do you go back to emailing people and sending them text messages? It's not you're not getting the same thing. And until there is a viable alternative to these services, which is not on the horizon, I think we're stuck with them. So it's kind of the surprising thing that I'm advising people to do is actually the only way out of the difficulty of the dark side with social media, I think, is actually to keep going through it. I think that ultimately what I'm asking people to do is to reflect on their use of social media and then ask themselves, if this isn't the way it should be, then how should it be changed? And the only way really I think it can be changed is actually through activity within the services themselves, but also your activity with the only powers that can actually do anything about this, which are our elected representatives. So I'm ultimately asking people everywhere to say, if social media is out of control, it is because our elected representatives have allowed that situation to take place. And we elect these people, and I think, every country has elections coming up at some point. I think people have to make it an issue. If they do want it to be changed, they have to get regulators involved in a more meaningful way than they have done up until now.
I have to come up with a counterpoint, I'm afraid, of China, and where they are so completely managing social media and using technology developed in this country, using this technology, I think, against their population in terms of thought control and narrowing of options. They've, and I don't know the name for it, but they've got a sort of good citizenship program going.
It's the 50 Cent Party.
What is it?
50 Cent Party. Because I think they get paid 50 cents to delete or report comments. So it's a volunteer volunteer group of people that are paid to delete or moderate comments. I think that might be what.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that in reality, in the real world, citizens will be, everybody will have a rating as to how good a citizen they are. And in part that may involve some monitoring of their use of social media. But, are they a member of the Communist Party? Have they done good works, social works? It sounds like a great thing, Yeah, okay. So everybody's going to be good. They're going to be competing to be good. But there's definitely a dark underbelly there, which has been explored extensively in science fiction. As much as the dark underbelly of all of this stuff has, there have been people there who have been thinking about these things in the world of science fiction, taking us to some of the various extremes. Well, it's probably about time for us to roll this up. I wanted to ask you, is there anything in this study that you did for the book that surprised you?
I think in preparing for this interview, I had a good think about that, because it's a really good question, and I think two things really struck me. That weren't not necessarily surprising, but sort of, I was surprised by how obvious they were, that it shouldn't have been surprising. And one I kind of hinted to earlier on was that there was, and I touch on it in the book, is that when Facebook introduced the news feed, there was an outcry, and it was, about privacy and so on. And then I realized that was over a decade ago, and we are still talking about Facebook in the context of controversies about Facebook and about privacy. And it's 10 years. It's at least, I think that particular one was 12 years ago. And that sort of says to me, we really have not got a handle on these things at all if we're still having these conversations, so on. So why have we not learned from them, and why have things not changed? That's one thing that really sort of strikes me as being quite unusual. And there's a very shallow cultural memory for all of these controversies, and a very little learning as well. Other thing that, which is sort of unrelated to that, is that if you go on to, say, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, a lot of these big tech companies, you can get even Netflix as well, you can get a family account. So there can be a parent, and then there can be children's accounts which are associated with it. So you pay a monthly subscription, and then everybody gets to use it. Lots of things operate in this way of having family accounts, because in our society currently, the family is still quite an important unit. However, one thing I did notice as well, which is just really very simple and silly almost, is that despite Facebook and Twitter and a lot of the different social media companies spending a lot of money on saying how safe they are, and to be fair, they have put in a lot of money in different places and safety policies and anti-bullying policies and resources and so on. You still can't get a family account on Facebook. A parent can't nominate. They can link to somebody and say, this is my son, but you can't get a family account in the sense of one account having a certain amount of oversight over other accounts. So ultimately these services, and that's in pretty much all social media accounts. I think YouTube might be kind of bringing, Google might have something like this, but fundamentally all of these services operate on the idea of the individual being the indivisible unit, the family important within there. And I think that's something for parents to think about when they're operating on this, is that they're dealt with on there as an individual. Your relationship to your child there isn't actually seen as important by the owners of these services. I think that's something for us to reflect upon about our society and how our society is reflected within social media.
Spoken like a young father who wants to protect his kids. And so
that's true.
Yeah. So Dr. Ciaran McMahon, the spelling is, I have to just let listeners know the spelling is new to me. Ciaran McMahon, really want to thank you for being my guest today. And clearly we could go on and on and on talking about these issues, but thanks so much for telling us about your book.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Dr. David Noyes. Thank you very much for having me.